Hello, welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. This time, I'd like to talk about illness in the Viking Age. Now, the Vikings are seen as big, hairy, strong, powerful warriors, afraid of nothing, unstoppable, almost as something approaching Superman. Yeah, but of course that isn't really the case. For one thing, Vikings, in the sense that most people understand that word as going around raiding and burning and raping anything that has a pulse, Vikings were mostly men, given that in order to be a Viking or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, one had to sail off in a ship and do something somewhere else when one got there. And in that sense, it was mostly men who did that. Not always. There were women sometimes involved, but generally the raiding aspect was carried out by men. So, of course, that would leave out women and children, who obviously were not big, hairy, powerful warriors. It doesn't include old or infirm men, or any men who, for that matter, for whatever reason, never got in a ship, and there would have been quite a number of those. Just being a Norse person at the time did not mean that you spent your time sailing around in a ship with a dragon's head on it. Viking was a profession, if you like, something that one did. It wasn't anything to do with national identity. So we're really talking about illness among the Norse people. Scandinavians, be they Norwegians, Danes, or Swedes, and those of them who settled in other lands, such as Britain and Ireland, Iceland, and so on, who are so often, incorrectly, all classed together as Vikings, as if they all came from the one place, they all did the same thing. And like any people anywhere throughout history, they got sick, just the same as everybody else. For one thing, we now know that the Old Norse had smallpox. Quite a surprising discovery, as it happens, because not only does it give us new information about the Norse people, but also clears up a medical mystery. While scientists always believed that the variola virus, which causes smallpox, had existed for possibly thousands of years, there was no direct evidence, no concrete scientific proof of it prior to the 17th century. But recently, a team of scientists were able to establish smallpox as being present over 1,400 years ago, and they found it in the Old Norse. They examined 11 Norse graves, the earliest dating from 600 AD in the Vendel era, and the latest almost at the end of the Viking Age in 1050 AD. The graves were located in Norway, Denmark, the United Kingdom, and Russia, as well as Åland Island, which lies in the Baltic Sea just off the southern coast of Sweden and was an important trading centre in those days. Smallpox was found in the teeth of the skeletons in those graves, though not the same strain of the virus as the one that was finally eradicated worldwide during the 20th century. The strains of the virus from well over 1,000 years ago were not identical to those that produced the dreadful suffering, even blindness and frequently death, that was so common over recent centuries and was finally only eradicated in the 20th century. And we don't know if it caused similar problems back then or not, even if it was fatal. But we do know that the people whose remains were examined had it in their bloodstream when they died, though we have no way of knowing if it caused their death or they just had it, or indeed if they were simply carriers of the virus without actually suffering from it themselves. Given the extensive travels of the Old North, both in the true sense of Vikings as raiders and as colonists and settlers setting up new homes in other lands, we must assume they would have spread the virus from time to time. And I should think studies will be carried out on non-Norse graves to look for evidence of that. That would seem logical. We don't know exactly what caused smallpox, wherever or whenever it originated, nor how the Norse people came to have it. Did they spread it to others on their so far-flung travels, or did they actually acquire it themselves on those travels? Obviously, there's really no way of knowing that. But it is thought that it was probably an animal condition that migrated to humans, and it had probably been around for thousands of years before the Vikings. Historians do think it existed many thousands of years before the Viking Age, but that is based solely on references in ancient writings to the way people died. So it could have been smallpox, or they could have died of something else with similar symptoms. Or given the difference between the virus found in the Norse bodies and the recent form of it, symptoms might well have been quite unlike those we associate with the virus. Perhaps ancient graves may in the future be checked for that and might well move it further back in history than 1400 years ago. Now, believe it or not, there is actually an officially recognized Viking disease. Oh yes, even often referred to as the Viking disease, though it should be more correctly called an Old Norse disease, since it wasn't related to anything to do with going anywhere in a ship or anything that might be caught from water or fish, harbours, or anything connected in any way with seafaring. The actual name is Dupuytren's contracture, named for Baron Guillaume Dupuytren, considered to have been the greatest surgeon in France during the 19th century, and it was he who first described the mechanics of the condition in 1833. Its proper name is palmar fascial fibromatosis, since it affects the palmar fascia, and that is the tissue that covers the tendons in the hand. And this tissue becomes tight, it contracts, pulling the fingers downwards towards the palm. And it's more likely to affect the middle fingers. It is an inherited condition, and most commonly found in Scandinavian countries, where it does seem to have originated, and in places with a direct historical Scandinavian connection, and for some reason more likely to show itself in persons over 50 years of age and to affect men more than women. Having its origins in Scandinavia naturally meant that it was carried to other lands. Now, not really by Viking raiders, who they wouldn't have remained in any one place they attacked long enough to leave any physical traces of that kind behind, since it required some kind of sexual relationships with the local people. Unlike smallpox, which they could indeed have given to others, even in a brief visit like a raid, but rather it would have been spread by the Norse settlers, who remained in other lands and colonized them, setting up villages that grew into towns, large cities in some cases. And later on, they began to intermarry with the local people, thus spreading any hereditary ailments they might have to the native population they had settled among. And Dupuytren's contracture, being an inherited condition, would naturally perpetuate itself among those populations, making it, correctly speaking, a Norse or Scandinavian disease spread by settled people rather than a Viking disease spread by guys jumping off ships with an axe in their hand looking for something, which from a terminology point of view, of course, is rather obvious. If it were a Viking disease, it would have to be spread by raiders, if we're going to see the term Viking in the popular sense of it. The condition is noticeably prominent in countries that would have a very strong Norse bloodline, countries that were heavily populated by Scandinavian settlers, and obviously prevalent in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. For example, only 5% of men over 60 have the condition in the United States of America, while 30% have it in Norway, which is quite a considerable difference. It is most common, however, in Iceland, and of course that is understandable, given that the entire population of Iceland is more or less descended from Norse settlers, whereas in other lands the Norse percentage of the populations would have been relatively small. Nor would people from other countries have settled later on in Iceland as readily as they might have in Scandinavia, given its location far out in the Atlantic. As I said, the contractions are caused by gradual thickening of the tissue under the skin of the palms of the hand, causing the tissue and the tendons to tighten and draw the fingers down, pulling them into a bent position, sometimes right down onto the palm. Even very simple everyday tasks can become difficult or even impossible, depending on how many fingers are affected or how severe the condition becomes. And while it isn't usually painful, it can be painful if any attempt is made to actually straighten the fingers, as well as causing itching. I know someone who actually has the condition, a woman in her 70s, and several of her fingers are bent right down almost to the palm. She basically has to do anything with her thumb and first finger, which are unaffected, but obviously that considerably reduces her ability to function properly. And the bent fingers, in her case, are quite painful. In severe cases, a person would be unable to perform even the simplest of tasks for themselves. Mentions of what are clearly Dupuytren's contracture can be found in the Old Norse sagas, where people are described as having cramped hands or their fingers lying down in the palm. And there was a suggested cure for the complaint. Oh yes, there was a cure suggested, though it does seem to have been somewhat drastic, we might say. It could well also have resulted in further complications. A woman having her bent fingers fixed by having someone kick her in the hand. Yes, I'm sure that probably straightened her fingers, though I'm rather less sure how well she could use her hand afterwards. As they say, don't try this at home. There is a skald mentioned, named Bjorn Krepphandi, his nickname meaning crippled hand, and he seems to have been a sufferer from the condition. There is no cure for the disease, though it can be treated in various ways, though often not with very much success, including steroid or enzyme injections or surgery to remove the thickened tissue. But doctors I've spoken to seem to prefer just leaving it alone, given the poor prognosis of treatment. Kicking the hand is, however, not really an option. There are forms of the contraction found in various countries without the Norse connection, but they seem to be slightly different. And for some reason, it seldom affects members of non-white races. Nobody seems to know why. Now, there is a condition known as trigger finger, which on the surface looks the same, but it isn't. It is caused by inflammation of the tendons, resulting in a finger becoming stuck in a bent position, while deprutans contracture results from thickening of tissue and the resulting pulling of the fingers, which is a different thing. And with trigger finger, the affected finger can often be straightened, though with some extra effort, making a clicking or snapping sound, rather like the pulling of the trigger on a gun, hence its nickname. You know, if an archaeologist says that during their excavation of a site they found shit, well, you know, he or she is not saying they wasted their time. They're not saying they didn't find anything. Oh, no. They mean, quite literally, they found shit. And that's good. In fact, an ancient cesspit is a beautiful thing to an archaeologist, because that can tell us a lot about what people ate, what their staple diet was, and also about many illnesses they may have suffered from. In 1972, archaeologists excavating part of the Norse city of Jorvik, or York, as it's called today, in the north of England, at that part of the city called Coppergate, discovered a turd. Yes, quite a sizable turd, actually, so 8 inches long and 2 inches wide. Thought to be possibly the largest piece of fossilized human feces ever discovered. And they were ecstatic over this wonderful discovery. Now, I mean, never mind boring old stuff you might dig up, like gold or silver, weapons or jewellery, complete skeletons. Oh, forget that. That's just run-of-the-mill, everyday stuff. They had hit the holy grail of archaeology. They had found shit. Oh, yes. Dr. Andrew Jones, a paleoscatologist working for the York Archaeological Trust, later summed it up as, "This is the most exciting piece of excrement I've ever seen. In its own way, it is as irreplaceable as the crown jewels." Yeah, he really liked it. A scatologist, by the way, is someone who studies poo. Yes. This particular piece of poo even has a name. It was so wonderful, they actually named it. And it is called the Lloyds Bank Coprolite, since a branch of that well-known banking establishment occupies the site where it was found. A coprolite, by the way, is what you call a fossilized piece of poo. In the famous alleged words of Michael Caine, not a lot of people know that. Probably not a lot of people really want to know it either. As far as I'm aware, the sex of whoever was responsible for this wonderful object isn't known. But it has been said that whoever they were, they had not, well, produced, shall we say, for a few days. And I'm sure that at the moment of production, that person would never have thought that 1,000 years later, people would be jumping for joy at finding it. Now, sad to say that in 2003 it suffered considerable damage while on exhibition to students when a teacher dropped it, and it smashed into 3 pieces. But don't worry. It survived, and it was carefully glued back together, and it is now displayed in all its ancient glory in the Jorvik Viking Centre. Now, if you just had dinner, you might wish to pause the video at this point and perhaps watch it later. Or if you are of a very sensitive and easily upset disposition, you might perhaps just care to, run it forward a bit. You have been warned. Whoever was responsible for this poo was not a great eater of fruit or vegetables, and seems to have lived on meat and grains, such as bran, pollen grains and cereal bran being found in the specimen. Now, that doesn't mean that vegetables weren't available in Jorvik. They were in considerable quantities. There's plenty of evidence of them discovered at the same site, as well as fruit and nuts. And most people would probably have eaten a much more varied diet than the individual responsible for the famous poo, which I'll come to in a moment. But the real significance of this poo is what it says about health rather than diet, the health of the individual who produced it, obviously, and probably the health of at least a section of the general population. How this particular person came to have the medical conditions they did is, I suppose, hard to say in their case, though it would have been related in some way to poor sanitation and bad hygiene in some form, indicating ingestion of water or dirt contaminated with feces, or eating unwashed or unpeeled fruit or vegetables. And it doesn't mean that everyone in Jorvik had exactly the same thing, nor how bad they would have been in individual cases. But it certainly suggests that it wouldn't have been uncommon. Perhaps not totally common, but certainly not uncommon. So what was wrong with this person's poo? Large numbers of eggs were found in it, indicating whipworm and mawworm infection. And these lovely little things are parasites that live in the large intestine. And they can produce anything from mild to very severe problems, including inflammation of the bowel, bloody diarrhea, and stomach aches, with symptoms very similar to duodenal or gastric ulcers. And in some very severe cases, they can actually migrate to other parts of the body, even into the head, where they can be found in the nose and the ears. They can cause nausea and vomiting, weight loss, and sometimes fecal incontinence. So they're not something, they're not something you really want to have. The whipworm, incidentally, is so called because it's thick at one end and it tapers to the other, resembling a whip. And a female worm can lay anything up to 20,000 eggs per day. That's a lot of eggs. And they then hatch and they produce larvae in the small intestine, and they move then into the large intestine on reaching maturity. You see why I said you might want to run that bit on. Now, that actually had nothing to do with poor diet among the Old Norse, though that might be the first thing someone would think of. Actually, the diet of those times was quite a balanced and healthy one. In fact, their food was better quality and more genuinely nutritious than much of what we eat today. And their personal hygiene was far higher than most others of their day, which I'll come to in a moment. But as to diet, they didn't add chemicals to everything. They didn't bulk things with additives or fill them with various preservatives. They didn't consume large quantities of salt nor sugar. Well, of course, they couldn't have used sugar for the obvious reason they didn't have any. But nowadays, the actual natural value of so many things is reduced, sometimes even obliterated altogether, by how we process them. Bread and rice, for example. Brown rice, the way it should be, has fibrous bran, it has nutritious germ, it has carb-rich endosperm in it. But making it all nice and white because we like the look of that lovely, lovely, fluffy white rice, it removes the bran and the germ, the most nutritious part of it. You're getting bulk, but you have reduced the nutritional value of what you're eating. Milk has much of its value taken out of it. If you've ever had milk straight from the cow on a farm, as I have at Clockerhead one year, you'll know it's nothing like what you get in the local supermarket. You pour it out and it sort of goes glop. Read the ingredients in just about anything you buy, and how often is it just the natural foodstuff itself, unaltered as nature intended it, simply packaged? No, there's a lot of numbers and often unpronounceable names the length of your arm that have been added to it. Yes, it may last longer, of course. There may not be funny things like those little whipworms in it, but the nutritional value of our food today is far less than it was 1,000 years ago. I mean, that is a fact. You can't really argue any other way. Now, the Vikings were hunters, of course, as well as fishermen and farmers. So meat was naturally a staple part of their diet, and that could include pork, mutton, beer, goats, elk or boars, and horses as well. And their considerable association with the sea meant that they consumed a lot of fish of various kinds, as well as seals and whale meat. The most common methods of cooking meat would be boiling it and making it into a broth or stew, or roasting it, as they did with boar meat. Bread was, of course, very nutritious, as I've said, made as it was with the whole grain, and it was a standard part of meals. And stale bread was still edible by serving it along with a stew to soften it up a bit. They were, as I said, farmers. After all, in order to make bread, you have to actually grow the stuff you make it from. Something that is often overlooked by people who see the Norse as nothing more than raiders. And they had cabbage, carrots, and turnips in their diet, as well as fruits like apples, plums, and various berries. There was also something resembling modern-day yogurt called skyr, which is actually still made in Iceland today. So poor diet, was not responsible for Norse illness. It was actually a very healthy and balanced diet. The problems came from other things, principally various parasites like those I've already mentioned. They could come from foodstuffs being present in the soil crops were grown in, especially if excrement had been used as a fertilizer, as it frequently was. And water was a problem, since it was frequently contaminated, something that was actually realized at the time, which is why ale and mead became staple things to drink. It didn't really have so much to do with being manly or anything like that, but it was safe. You drank that, and you didn't need to go and sort of, run to a hole in the ground somewhere. Another problem was that many families lived in close proximity with their animals. There would often be just one door between the family room and the room containing the animals. So the dangers from parasites was considerable. Parasites, of course, the people were completely unaware of. And I'm sure children going in and out, playing with goats and lambs and the like, would have been quite a contributing factor to that. Other illnesses of the time, unrelated to parasites, would have been pneumonia and arthritis. Now, arthritis was particularly common in the back, knees, and hands due to farming and other heavy activities, including, of course, frequent and prolonged rowing of longships. There was a skeleton discovered here in Dublin, and when a woman from the National Museum examined the body, examining the attachment points of the muscles, she said that this indicated that the man would have had considerable arm strength, resulting from a motion that would obviously indicate that he had done a lot of rowing. Now, obviously sanitation was not particularly good in the 9th century, and the existence of microorganisms and their relation with sanitation was completely unknown. But we do know that the Old Norse had a much better concept of personal hygiene than most other people of their time. And like other people in the Middle Ages, they did have privies located in separate buildings. But that was in the towns, where there was some attempt at hygienic conditions, though produce brought in from the surrounding countryside could still be infected, obviously. It was assumed that while, privies existed in towns, in the countryside people would have done whatever they needed to do wherever they happened to be at the time, or collected it in a bucket and spread it as fertilizer, or threw it in a river or whatever. But a recent discovery on the island of Zealand in Denmark, now that's changed ideas on that, when a 6-foot deep hole was found in what would have been a rural location. When the material at the bottom of the hole was analyzed, oh yes, here we go again, we're back to that good old shit, it proved to be human waste. And it was scientifically dated back to the Viking Age. Happy archaeologists. It was established as human rather than animal because it contained flower pollen that showed the consumption of honey, though whether it had been eaten or taken in mead wasn't possible to say, but honey was not given to animals. And the pollen wasn't airborne, which indicated that the hole had been enclosed, presumably in a structure of some kind. The discovery of post holes to either side of the hole confirmed that it had indeed been situated in some form of structure. So it would seem that even in the countryside, the Old Norse used privies. Well, that's not to say, of course, there was one on every farmstead, but the idea of people just doing it wherever they were, that is obviously incorrect. At least it is incorrect in some cases. And that also did not fit in with the considerable level of cleanliness and personal hygiene among the Norse people in other regards. Their level of hygiene and cleanliness was very high. People often see the Vikings as scruffy, unkept men, interested in nothing other than going around in dragon-headed ships, burning things and raping anything that was actually alive. But, that is far from the truth. The Norse were actually the cleanest people of their day. They combed their hair, they changed their clothes frequently, they washed their hands and faces every day, and they took a bath once a week, an unheard of thing elsewhere. The Anglo-Saxons, for example, were astonished at such unnecessary goings-on. An annual bath was more than good enough for them. And it has actually been suggested by some authorities that many people in those days may never actually have had any kind of immersion in water since their baptism. This paints a lovely picture. And, you know, there is actually a complaint about Norse cleanliness on record. It was recorded by an English monk and chronicler named John of Wallingford, who was writing in 1002 AD, just after the infamous St. Brice's Day massacre, when King Ethelred the Unready, who should really, I suppose, be known as King Ethelred the Completely Useless, rather foolishly ordered an attack on Danes living quite peacefully in his kingdom, thus bringing rather considerable retaliation down on himself. Now, some Anglo-Saxons were quite happy to kill the local Norsemen, not because the king thought it was a good idea, they probably didn't give a hoot what the king thought, but because of the Norse cleanliness. Yes, the far greater cleanliness of the Norse is what made the Saxons want to kill them, since Saxon women were actually going off with them in preference to their own men. The monk wrote that the Norsemen caused much trouble to the natives of the land, for they were wont, after the fashion of their country, to comb their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their garments often, and set off their persons by many frivolous devices. In this manner they laid siege to the virtue of the married woman, and they persuaded the daughters even of the noble to be their concubines. Well, you couldn't have that sort of thing going on, now could you? Of course, had the Anglo-Saxons tried washing a bit more, well, things might have been better. I'm sure the Norsemen were much more pleasant to be with than the local men, especially indoors on a hot day. You know, combs, tweezers, and earwax removing tools are common items recovered from Norse graves. And in fact, the type of comb usually called today a dust comb, you know, it is actually an Old Norse design, used 1,000 years ago and still used today in almost an unchanged form. Now, it's no longer generally made from bone or horn, and it's not as elaborately decorated, but the twin-sided design and even the shape is exactly the same as many examples of combs recovered from burial sites. It is quite a remarkable thing. From all of this, we can safely say that personal hygiene and general sanitation was of a very high standard for that day among the Norse. Now, that does raise the question, would the Old Norse have been less affected by illnesses due to bad hygiene than other peoples of their age, given their daily hand-washing, for example, and their personal grooming? Well, logic would seem to say yes, since washing our hands was and still is a vital part of reducing the risk of infection from any source. So it does seem likely that whatever nasty little things may have turned up in the legendary Jorvik poo, the Old Norse were probably less at risk than some other peoples of their time. I don't see how one could argue to the contrary on that point. Obviously, their greater sanitary efforts would have made them less susceptible to those things than other people. So, with that thought, we come to the end of this look at illness in the Viking Age, or, as I said more correctly, illness among the Old Norse. I hope you found it interesting, that it didn't put you off your dinner or cause the one you just had to come back. So till next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye for now. Okay.